I'm Brett from Heinemann. Today on the podcast, we have an excerpt from Heinemann's Forward Ed Slow Conference series. Today's conversation features Jennifer Serravallo, author of the New York Times bestseller The Reading Strategies book, as well as many other popular Heinemann professional books, and Rachael Gabriel, Associate Professor of Literacy Education at the University of Connecticut and co-author of Making Teacher Evaluation Work. Together, they discuss the process of research as systemic inquiry and how interpretations might impact our practice as responsive teachers. This conversation is part of Heinemann's video series Forward Ed, Forward Together in Education. If you'd like to watch the full video of this and other conversations, you can find them on the Heinemann Publishing Facebook page or on our YouTube channel.
All right. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, Jen.
Oh my gosh. After all our Twitter conversations and emails, here we are talking face to face. Well, kind of, right?
Yeah, as close as we can get. I'm so excited to do this. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for accepting the invitation. So I read your recent Ed leadership piece and absolutely loved it. And one of the points that you make in the piece is that in order to have a scientific approach to literacy, we need to be making sure we're looking at the sciences, plural. What fields of science do you think are getting ignored right now in the conversation? And I'm wondering why you think that might be.
I think it shifted a little bit because the conversation keeps evolving. So when I first wrote that, I was thinking more about kind of the divide between natural and social sciences. Like there's a lot of emphasis on neuroscience and cognitive science. And cognitive science bridges natural and social, or kind of the hard sciences and the soft ones. And so that was what I had in mind when I was writing it. But I now think that there's been a little bit of shifting. There's been some things taken up from linguistics, but not everything. And so again, it's sort of the finite item level knowledge from linguistics, but not the social and cultural aspects of how language actually works. And so kind of picking and choosing from a couple of different sciences and calling it, still putting it under the banner of the science of reading as if it's a singular thing. And as if it's the only thing. So if it's singular like that, it's got to be like it's in opposition to something. So there's the science, and then for everything else, there's MasterCard, or for everything else, it's not scientific, so it shouldn't be used. So it's kind of an unhelpful positioning because it doesn't leave any room for any new discoveries. And it also doesn't leave room for anything to add nuance or questioning or anything that destabilizes the central truth of these are the things that should happen. And we know exactly how and why for everybody.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I wonder about, and maybe the incorporation of linguistics and what language means, is the demographics of kids that tend to be studied and those that tend not to be studied in some of the research that's being privileged. What do you have to say about that?
So I love this because I was a psychology major in college. I remember reading about a study. I think it's called The Strangest People or the Weirdest People. I'm sure we can link to it in the show notes. I talk about this a little bit in my Reading Teacher article about the science of reading. And it basically sort of broke down how much of what we know about psychology is based on studies of freshmen in college, because, freshman psychology students have to participate in studies. And so like a huge amount of what we think we know, like as if it can be completely known, but a lot of the patterns that we've recognized that we think are, definitely incomplete and possibly wrong, are based on like 18 to 21-year-old people that go to liberal arts schools and take Psych 101. And that ends up being a pretty small proportion of the population. And so that doesn't really speak to or recognize. And then, of course, we also can look at psychology journals and see that they're mostly edited by and written by folks in the Western Hemisphere who write and publish in English. And if we look closer, it still is mostly white, mostly men. That's shifting, but it's not equal by any means. And so in terms of perspectives and interpretation, like what we know, and I'm using goofy like inflection on that word, like there's no known. We have some evidence and we make sense of it, but we do the making. We do make the sense of it. We don't just have kind of a certainty. I think certainty in general is kind of unscientific. Like we do a lot to make sure we understand how certain we are about science. We have lots of different statistical tools and conventions and agreed upon ways of saying things in scientific publications that show how certain we think we are. But certainty, complete certainty, isn't a thing because humans are so different from each other.
Yeah, let's talk about that idea of certainty. So, right, when there's something that's worth being published, it's got to have some finding to it, right? And the findings need to be somewhat statistically significant, right? For those who haven't taken statistics in college or haven't gone through research design methods classes, or maybe it's been a while, can you explain in plain English, what does statistical significance even mean?
So statistical significance just means better than chance. So the classic example is like flipping a coin, like it'll be one or the other. And that doesn't mean the coin is weighted in any particular direction. But once we get to the point where it keeps being heads over and over, more than you'd expect from chance, we start to think that it is significant. And then we, being the scientific community, has set levels of what we think is acceptable. And in education research, we usually set the level at 95% certainty. We basically say we want to be 95% confident that this is not a mistake. Not that this is always true for everybody, but that this is not just purely chance. That when kids grew under these circumstances, it was because of the circumstances instead of due to chance.
And so that 95% does not mean it's going to work for 95% of children. It just means 95% sure that it's not just a fluke, right?
Right. In this case, no, it's not going to work for everybody. It's just like what I'm telling you about the 30 kids I tested or the 3,000 kids I tested. I'm 95% sure that I'm telling that what I think happened. Not necessarily that it would happen anywhere else, but that what I think happened. So on the 21 undergraduates that I tested from their Psych 101 class, it's just their certainty about their claim, not about the generalizability of the claim.
Yeah. And so I think that's something that I think is misunderstood, right? This idea that, okay, this research study found this, so therefore let's put this thing, which may not even have been studied in a classroom, into practice in classrooms for all children.
Yeah.
No.
That's not what that means.
No.
Yeah, that's not, no.
Yeah. So this idea, like this thing works, so let's do it for all children. I feel like that's another common thing that's being talked about now, right? That there's this, certain advocates are saying that all kids can benefit from this particular sequence, pace, and methods because it was shown in this study or in this series of studies. I'm wondering, in what ways do you feel like that thinking is flawed? This idea that we should just do this for everybody because it's shown to work for some.
Like, how long do we have? Sorry.
Yeah, right. Just go on all day.
I think that one potential place for common ground is the idea that instruction should be responsive to the students. I think the division comes back again when we figure out like what being responsive looks like. Fidelity to the program is one thing, fidelity to the child is another. And I think folks that are used to like engaging in child watching and using that as a way to fuel their instruction are frankly appalled that you would follow the program instead of the child. I think folks that don't know how to do child watching don't even know it's a thing, and are frankly appalled that somebody would make stuff up instead of following a program. Your life opportunity is attached to being literate. Your schooling opportunity, you're standing in the community. Even if it's just your child, you're standing in the community as a parent if your child is struggling with literacy. These are really big things that hit on a bunch of different kinds of fears. And so when someone suggests that there's certainty attached to a program because it's research-based, or when they say that there's certainty attached to an approach because it's scientific, folks are willing to give up a lot for certainty. Like we see this all the time in kind of fundamentalist approaches to anything, to dieting, which I write about a little bit in the leadership article, to religion, to really anything. When we promise certainty, we get a big T truth and say like, this is how it is, and you can count on it. Usually somebody's lying.
Yeah. I mean, the stakes are very high. Everyone agrees we want kids to be highly literate, not only skilled, but also love to read. We're all on the same page about that. It's just a question of what exactly are the techniques that are going to help. And, as the experience of a New York City public school teacher with more than 30 kids in a classroom, ranging 3 full grade levels, to those who are really in the classroom with kids and seeing the wide range.
Right.
The idea that one size fits all is just a really challenging, really challenging idea to accept.
And the acrobatics you have to do to make it work. So if you are in a position where you have to use this particular approach on this particular day, the acrobatics you have to do to hold kids' attention and to make it worth it for them to pay attention, there's a cost to those. So, you do see there's a time cost, but there's also like an energy and effort and investment cost on the part of the child to like manage themselves, to be calm and appropriately engaged, but also on the part of the instructor. And so even if you had an extra 15 minutes for something else, you've used up a lot of the resources in the classroom, a lot of the interactional resources that could have supported learning to support an approach that may or may not have been a good fit for the group of kids that you have. And that could be for all 30 of your 30. I found this line of research that Carol Connor did at ASU or in Arizona over a series of years that kind of suggested that there's like maybe 2 or 3 versions of literacy instruction that should be happening all the time. And if they were happening, then most everybody would be getting what they needed in that classroom, not in 17 different tiers of intervention, but like in their one and only main experience. We would be getting about 95% of the kids, we like that number, what they need. And it's not a million things, it's 2 or 3. And 2 or 3 we can manage, especially given that some of those things are to allow some students to be more self-directed and less teacher-directed. We want to give teachers a resource that they can use and not expect them to come up with everything on their own.
And I think if we want to, in support of the idea of some kind of program or curriculum or scope of sequence, if we want teachers to really be meaningfully looking at kids' work, making assessment-based decisions, attempting some sort of differentiation for whatever that means in your classroom, they can't be reinventing the wheel constantly. I think it's wise to equip teachers with something to follow, and then in addition, give them the tools they need to really look at their kids, understand what they need, and make some decisions to reteach, pre-teach, change the teaching, whatever it is to differentiate.
I write about this. I cite this study called Shackles and Scaffolds all the time because it's a perfect metaphor for curriculum, that if you aren't allowed to play with it, then it ends up holding you back in your learning as an educator and in your satisfaction with your job as an educator. But if you have nothing at all, it could have been a scaffold for your learning. It could have given you what you needed so you had room to explore and to experiment and to watch your students and see how things are going. Because, experience should add up to knowledge, right? Like teachers teaching for a bunch of years, you have all of these experiences that have accumulated that could accumulate into more understanding.
I mean, I think what that's talking about is just continuous development, continuous learning on the part of teachers. And like you said, the flexibility to use or not use certain aspects of resources that you have at your disposal. And I think sometimes there is an undercurrent of this idea that embracing research means that we're discounting teacher expertise or teachers' firsthand experience. I mean, I've read studies where the sample size is only 30 children, and then there's teachers who have 30 children a year times 20 years, hundreds and hundreds of children. And if they're the kind of teacher who really thinks, reflects, studies, adapts, changes, you have so many case studies there to be learning from.
Right.
And that experience can count for something, right?
Right. So maybe, but I think that's one big maybe. Pedagogically, it'll count for something if and only if you were engaged in systematic inquiry of some kind. I think the idea that teachers are thinking, reasonable, intellectual beings, there's this kind of chicken egg thing happening where systems are created to not let them be. The way PD is designed, the traditional way PD is designed, and lots of folks have found workarounds to make it more thinking and intellectual for teachers. But the idea that you kind of like have these 5 full days of the year and you do something different on each of the 5 full days and you pick those things like a year and a half earlier, and they're sort of scheduled for you before some of those teachers even work at that school. So how could you know that that was what they needed in their own growth and development? Like there's sort of silly structures that don't treat teachers as professionals, let alone intellectuals. And yet, if you are going to be learning from practice, you have to be an intellectual about it. You have to have, and this is a little Virginia Woolfy, but like you have to have the time and the space to make sense of what you're seeing year after year, to like notice the patterns and build on them. And you also have to have colleagues to talk about them with, because if you don't hash some of this stuff out, you can't grapple by yourself all the time. And if you don't have an opportunity to talk with colleagues, or your colleagues aren't available for that kind of thing, then I don't think it does accumulate.
On top of it, there's this real barrier to accessing some of the research, whether it's like literal barrier, I can't access it because I log in and it's $30 to download this one article. It's access in terms of time. It's access in terms of, I mean, some of the journal articles, no offense to your colleagues, but it's written in a very hard to understand language. So there's all kinds of barriers. I'm just wondering what your response or thoughts are to that.
Full disclosure, I'm on the board of the International Literacy Association at the moment. But when I look at ILA's materials before I was on the board, and one of the reasons that I was willing to run is they are never signed by one person. Like any sort of information that is put out has like the longest list of names. And it looks like the liner notes of the CD, like teeny little print and like a bazillion people. Because even if like 5 or 6 people wrote the words, like typed them into a computer, it gets vetted and vetted like over and over again. And they don't put it out as like, this is a research document or a policy brief, unless lots of folks have said, yes, we agree. And so there is,
and it's very accessible. I want to say, I feel like ILA has done a really good job of making things accessible. Not everything's behind a paywall. That recent, the recent edition of the Reading Research Quarterly, where I think every article was available to everybody. I mean, that's remarkable. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Yes. Oh, good. I'm so glad. And that's part of the hope. Like we'll come back to that issue, and that's part of the hope that's coming. So anyway, sorry. But like, in some ways it's inevitable, because there just aren't studies that like that answer the question you're trying to answer. And so if you're like, somebody goes to Facebook and says like, what should I teach tomorrow? There isn't a study about that, sorry. And or like, what is a great spelling program for 9th graders who live in Nebraska and are all left-handed? Like, we don't have a study for most of the things that you might go with a question about. And so this is something that doc students often are frustrated with when they first get into kind of searching for the research that they want to read about in an area, is you have to figure out how to ask for it. Like, what are the keywords that I'm looking for to actually get me that article? So we end up with these translations of research. Some of them are faithful translations, some of them are not. Some of them are thoughtful interpretations, some of them are not. We need them. Like we will never have the research to answer all of our questions. We need faithful, thoughtful interpretations. And what we don't often think about with a lot of these programs that say that they're research-based, nobody's researched them. They're just based on ideas that have been researched, sometimes from an idea from this study and one from that study, and one, in a combination that's never been tested. It's our best guess. I think one thing we have to be good at is both sides, sort of like as a consumer, knowing that you found a faithful interpreter, and also as the profession, sending out more faithful interpreters. Like, your work is powerful because you're a faithful interpreter, and because people can tell, like, because when it rings true and when it doesn't. And part of the way that practitioners know when it rings true is that like it has resonance with what they've seen before. And that is sort of the heart of peer review. Like, I determine that it is right, it's true, because it rings true with what I've seen before. And so when practitioners give you their peer review, and you know that you've drawn on things that like other folks have found in controlled systematic study, your own systematic study or controlled systematic study of like the last 100 years or of whatever that's available, then you've not just got resonance, but you've got overtones, and you've got, what do you call them? Harmonics and sympathetic harmonics. And so people, when they're reading it, can actually make new connections from your work. I think that's how we know that it's right. Like, it's fruitful, it multiplies. It also has some relationship to research, and it resonates with these other ideas, and potentially even helps you form new ones. You're playing a song that people have been playing, right? That we have because you're a faithful interpreter. I worked with Dick Allington as my doctoral advisor, and I always thought, like, he did his own research. original research. So I don't want to minimize that. But the reason that he was powerful in our field is because he was a really good storyteller, and he would tell the story of the research.
I was just going to say, I think we also need researchers like you, like Nell Duke, like people who are actually in classrooms with teachers and kids. So I think I don't know how rare you think that is in your field overall, or how common that is, or people that are conducting research and are regularly partnering with teachers, hearing from teachers, having teachers try things in their classrooms. This divide between research and what happens in classrooms, a lot of people have talked about this. I think that's a really important hurdle as well.
Yeah. It's another one that's like partly personal choice and partly structural. Like the way that you advance in teaching is to be really good at teaching, not to also partner with, you have to take on a lot extra to do that. And you have to take on risk to do that. And then same thing with researchers, it's disincentivized in lots of silent ways. Out loud, it's incentivized. Like, oh, our researchers are so engaged. But they also do these 17 other things, which make sure that they never actually get to leave their desk. So there's some challenges to that. There's a lot of research on research practice partnerships and what makes them go wrong, and when they go well. And it's always more complicated than people think that it might be, because we're battling two structures that aren't made to mesh well together. But I think the more we know about each other, the better we are at finding the workarounds that would help us imagine a structure that would work well together. The good news in terms of access, not accessibility, but access to the actual articles, is that I think the pandemic has really sped up the timeline for publishers to not just consider, but make motions moving toward being open access, and really changing the whole funding model for how academic research is funded. So right now it's funded by subscription, so that's why it's protected. And usually libraries or university systems buy subscriptions to all the journals so that the library has all the journals, and then the journals just run based on the money from the subscriptions. It's going to be different now. It's going to be there are open access journals now, and somebody has to pay for it. So advertisers will pay for it, or an institution will pay for people to publish.
I can see the pros and cons of this.
Yep.
I think, let's see if we're thinking the same thing. This is news to me. It's super interesting. I feel like the pro is open access. People have access to it. Great, super. The con is I'm wondering if what's going to happen to journals will be what's happening to other kinds of media right now. They're looking for clicks in order to get more advertisers, and therefore will publish certain things in order to get that attention.
And certain people. So controversial things. So the Science of Reading special issue was a really good one to do open access, because it's a hot button, and so people will click on it. And it had lots of big names in it, and so that's awesome. It totally disincentivizes publishing unknown authors and disincentivizes publishing unsexy topics, and I wonder about that in a big way. Yeah,
for sure. Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me. I've loved this conversation. I hope it's the first of many.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Our thanks to Jen and Rachel for their time today. You can find Jen on Twitter @JSerravallo and at Heinemann.com/Jennifer Serravallo. You can find Rachel on Twitter @Rachael Gabriel. This conversation was a part of Heinemann's Forward Ed series. To watch this and other conversations, visit Heinemann's Facebook page or our YouTube channel, or you can visit Heinemann.com/forwardtogether to see the whole series. The Heinemann Podcast is a production of Heinemann Publishing. It is produced and edited by Steph George. Sound mixing by Steph George. Our creative producer is Lauren Audette. And our executive producer is me, Brett Whitmarsh. To learn more about the Heinemann Podcast, visit blog.heinemann.com. Thanks for listening.